Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to look at Chapter 3 in your OpenStax textbook. We're going to be talking about demand and supply. And demand and supply as a model looks at markets for goods and services, and it's one of the most common econ models you'll encounter. It is technically a micro model, but it's really essential for our understanding of most economics. It really just pops up everywhere, and we will use it in macro. We'll just build on it when we start to talk about the whole economy. But it's a really important chapter, and it's a little bit intense. There's a lot of new terminology and a lot of different ways of describing things that you actually already encounter, because we're all out there being consumers every day, buying goods and services all the time. And some of us have worked on the supply side too, whether if we're a small business owner, if we're working on supplying our labor to the market as an employee, or if we are working at a place where we're doing customer service. So you should have some experience with these things intuitively. We're just going to apply the econ terminology and the econ model to help you understand it better. There's going to be a lot of new terms. Let me just pull through them. One of the big ones, ceteris paribus, means all else held constant, or all other things being equal. That's really important in economics, especially with this model. We're going to only change one thing at a time. And so we're going to take things step by step. We're going to talk about different types of goods. We'll talk about inferior goods, normal goods, complements, and substitutes. We'll talk about the benefit of the market, looking at consumer surplus and producer surplus. We'll talk about price and different price controls, like a price ceiling and a price floor. We'll talk about demand and supply, looking at the demand curve, the supply curve, quantity demanded and quantity supplied, excess demand, excess supply. Also, we'll have a law of demand and supply, which is pretty exciting because economists don't have a lot of laws. We're not physicists. We can't speak with a lot of certainty because we're usually dealing with people. So grab your notes, check out your slides, grab your textbook, and let's get started on Chapter 3, Demand and Supply. Okay, so here we are in Chapter 3. So the outline is that we're going to start with just outlining what the demand and supply market looks like, what the demand and supply model looks like. It's going to look kind of like that. We'll talk about what we mean when we talk about equilibrium, and this is all talking about the markets for goods and services. So individual firms selling goods to individual consumers. Then we'll talk about different ways that we can see something happen in the market, factors that will shift the demand curve or shift the supply curve, and then we'll talk about how that changes equilibrium. We're going to find out that there's an equilibrium price and quantity for every model, and we'll talk about what to do if a factor changes, how we find that equilibrium, and what that equilibrium means. This is where we'll talk a little bit about what happens if there's a change in an economy. We'll talk about different kinds of price controls. Specifically, we'll be talking about price ceilings, which is a limit on how high things can get, how high a price can be, and price floors, which is a limit on how low it can be. The book has some examples. The most common examples of a price ceiling and a price floor that you've ever experienced, probably, or might be familiar with, is a price ceiling is something like rent control, where it says, hey, rent can't go above this level. And a price floor is minimum wage, where the price of labor is not allowed to go below a certain floor. So we'll talk about that and what that means for efficiency. And that's where we'll close it up, is that last section in 3.5. We'll talk about what demand, supply, and our model for markets for goods and services means for efficiency, and how economists measure that efficiency, which is going to tell us and give us a sense of why economists feel so strongly that a market-based economy is the way to go. Okay, so what you're going to see here is we're going to be taking moving on from our first model where we looked at the PPF, the production possibilities frontier, and the budget constraint, to a more complicated but also a more useful model. And it's going to help us explain a lot of things. So the textbook starts out talking about the idea of why organic vegetables and fruits cost more. Theoretically, they should be affordable. They're going to tend to have lower transportation costs because they have to be produced and consumed more locally because of the nature of the production. Conventional produce is going to tend to have higher fertilizer costs and other things. So why is it so expensive? We see this a lot with new things being expensive. And so the reality is it's not just about the cost it takes to produce something. A determinant of the price of a good or a service can also be based on demand and supply. And that's what we're going to find and talk about today. So we'll do a lot of fun examples. So let's take a look. What do we mean, first of all, when we talk about demand? Well, when we talk about demand, we're talking about the amount of something, the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. And so that's the important first idea, is when we have a demand, well, we'll talk about having a demand curve, but when we say the phrase demand, we're talking about different quantities at different prices. And so we're talking about capturing a sort of overall big picture of how willing and able consumers are to purchase a good at given prices. Does that make sense? So we're not just talking about one price, one quantity, we're talking about the whole entire general relationship. So how much soda are people willing to buy given a price of $1, a price of $5, a price of 50 cents? The price is just what the consumer pays for a unit of that good or service. And so we'll talk a lot about price and we'll talk about quantity because that's going to be how we measure the sort of two mechanisms, the two main levers of demand and supply. And one really interesting thing, and it's going to sound nitpicky, but I promise you it's important, is the difference between demand and quantity demanded. So demand is the whole picture of all the goods and services that a consumer wants to buy at every price. Quantity demanded is an exact point on that demand curve. So if price is $2, quantity demanded is that Q at that price. And we'll talk about that more as we get into this model more, but you just want to be aware that both for demand and supply, we're going to differentiate between demand and quantity demanded and supply and quantity supplied. And that difference and what's the word? There's an important reason for making that distinction. That distinction comes for a reason. Because it's sort of like the difference between talking about a grain of rice versus a whole bowl of rice. The next thing we want to talk about is this idea of the law of demand. The law of demand says that holding everything else constant, if nothing else changes, we're going to tend to expect that when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So that means there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And that makes intuitive sense to us for most goods. We'll talk about exceptions because there are exceptions to the law. But if you think about, I was just at a store buying markers and the price went down. It was on sale. When the price goes down, my crazy brain starts thinking maybe I need 3 boxes of markers instead of 1. And we're going to tend to see that, right? That's why stores have sales, is they think, okay, if we lower the price, people will buy more. And that's what the law of demand says. The law of demand says the lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded, as long as we hold everything else constant. Okay? So what does that mean for us? It means we can look at a series of prices, a range of prices, and the quantity demanded, and we can use that to determine the relationship between price and quantity demanded for a good or a service. We do this with two things. We do it with the demand schedule, which is just a table that says, okay, price of 50 cents, price of $1, price of $2, price of $3, and then the quantity demanded at each price. We can also describe this relationship graphically with a demand curve. And a demand curve is going to be a line that shows that relationship between price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. Okay, and it's going to be that way for every model of supply and demand. For the market's models of supply and demand, or demand and supply, we're going to always put quantity on that x-axis and price on that y-axis. And so that's why, because of that law of demand, that negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, we're going to tend to see downward sloping demand curves. And I'll do another example for y'all because I do think this is a really important concept, but there's an example in the book and there's an example here in this slides. And so you can see here, this is the example from the book talking about price per gallon and demand for gasoline. And if you look in the book, you can see the demand schedule where we have the various prices, $1 for a gallon of gas, $1.20, $1.40, $1.60, $1.80, $2.20. The same thing is shown here on the demand curve. So we graph the demand curve based on that demand schedule. Does that make sense? So what we're saying here is we can go out into the world and observe how much gasoline is being demanded at every price. And then we can record that information in the demand schedule and graph it with the demand curve. The downward sloping demand curve tells us that the law of demand is being obeyed. And so I'm just going to do one really quick example. Let's say I want to buy a bottle of water. I'm going to put quantity down here. And I'm going to put price up here. And then if I say, okay, well, at 50 cents, people want 10 bottles of water, but at $1, people only want 8 bottles of water. At $1.50, people want 6. And then at $2, people want 4. That gives me different points based on the demand schedule. The demand schedule would have the prices and the quantities demanded. And then I can graph that relationship and derive a demand curve through those points. And the demand curve will always slope downward because of that law of demand relationship. And if it's ever hard to remember, the trick I love is just that demand, D for down, D for demand. So demand is always going to be downward sloping so long as the law of demand is followed. And it will in almost every case, especially in our class. Okay, so far so good. So now we have demand, half of the story. The demand schedule shows us the quantity demanded at every given price. So demand captures multiple quantities demanded at multiple prices. Okay? On the other side of things, we have supply. And supply is, if demand is the consumer side, supply is the firm side. It's the amount of good or service that a producer is willing to supply to the market at a given price. And so quantity supplied is the same as saying it's correlated to, or it's the corollary for, quantity demanded. Quantity supplied is the number of units of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at a given price. And we're going to see that have a positive relationship. So the law of supply, same as we saw with the law of demand, is saying that assuming everything else stays constant, we expect a consistent relationship between price and quantity supplied. As price goes up, firms are going to be willing and able to supply more goods and services to the market. As prices go down, quantity supplied is going to go down. And when we're talking about these markets, we're not assuming that we're talking about one person and one firm. We're talking about the whole market. So maybe we're talking about all of the sandwich shops in a town, or all of the stores in a town, or in a city, or in a state, or in a country. We're going to expect that relationship to stay positive because the higher prices go, the more firms are willing and able to supply goods to the market. And so it's not just one firm supplying more, it's all firms supplying more, and maybe more firms. And so we're going to expect the law of supply to have a positive relationship where price goes up, firms supply more, price go down, firms supply less. Okay? So we're really going to see supply and demand be two sides of the same coin, which means just like we saw with demand, we're going to have a supply schedule, which is just a table that shows the price at the quantity supplied at different prices, and a supply curve, which is going to give us that graphic representation of that law of supply, of prices going up and firms supplying more at every price. Okay? So, again, we have an example in the book. It's the same example that we're going to see in the slides, where we see a supply schedule for prices of gasoline, and then how many gallons suppliers are willing to give to the market, what the quantity supplied is at each price. And as price goes up, quantity demanded is going to go up because it's going to obey that law of supply. Okay? And so if we graph that relationship, what we'll see is that at a very low price, a small quantity of gasoline is supplied. But as the price increases, more and more firms are willing and able to supply more and more gasoline to the market. That's going to give us an upward sloping supply curve because of that positive relationship. As price goes up, firms supply more units, and so we're going to tend to see the supply curve be upward sloping. So that'd be like if firm said, let's put one more point in, at a price of firms would be willing and able to supply, say, at 50 cents, they're only going to supply maybe 2 units to the market. At $1, they'll supply 4. At $1.50, they'll supply 6. At $2, they'll supply 8. And at $3, they'd supply 11. We can connect those points to get a supply curve that is going to be upward sloping, showing how, as prices go up, more and more firms are willing and able to supply more and more units to the market. More and more units of the good or the service, more haircuts, more oil changes, more pizzas, whatever. What happens now is we want to put supply and demand together, just like I did. And what you're going to see is no matter how you draw your supply and demand curve, there is going to be a point where supply and demand intersect. And that point is called the equilibrium. So that is right there. Equilibrium is where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. It is the price and quantity where there is no economic pressure to change the price or the quantity. So we call it equilibrium because we're stable, we're happy, and there's no incentive for the market to move. And so there's going to be an equilibrium price, the price at which, in this case, $1.50, because at $1.50, quantity supplied is 6 and quantity demanded is 6. So I'm going to call that Q star and I'm going to call that P star because those are my happy place. And so what we can see is, and there's an example of this, I believe, in your textbook too. Yeah. There's an example in your textbook, but let's take a look at it for our own purposes, is that equilibrium is going to tend to be where the market is best off, where consumers are best off, producers are best off, and society as a whole is best off because there's no pressure to change. So what would happen if, let's say you were the water bottle salesperson? What would you want to do? Maybe you'd want to raise prices. Let's say you say, hey, what happens if we charge $2? If price becomes $2, what happens to the market? Well, you're going to be willing and able to supply more water bottles to the market, but what are consumers going to say? Consumers are going to say, wow, at a price of $2, I only want to buy 4 bottles of water. So we're going to have a surplus or excess supply. 8 units are being supplied to the market. Consumers only want 4. So the surplus or the excess supply is going to be 4 bottles of water. you're willing and able as a supplier to sell more and consumers want to buy less. So if you were that producer, what would you do? You could lower your price. How much would you lower your price? Maybe 25 cents, maybe 10 cents, but you would keep lowering it until you got to this point, because at this point, there's no surplus. So there's no incentive to change your behavior. We can see the same thing on the other side, right? Consumers like low prices. What if we lower prices? What if we went down to, say, $1? If we went down to $1, well, the opposite problem would happen. We would have excess demand or a shortage, because now we would have a situation where consumers want more. People who didn't want a bottle of water before are like, well, for that price, it is hot today, sure. So the quantity demanded is going to be higher. It's going to be 8, and the quantity supplied is going to be lower because firms aren't going to want to sell that much at that price. So what we'd have down here, instead of having a surplus, we'd have a shortage. There'd be more demand. Demand would exceed supply. We would have excess demand. So what would firms say? They'd say, wow, if we raise our prices, people will still buy more than we have. Think about it this way. If you were running a coffee shop or a cafe and every day you ran out of everything you made, you would think, wow, I could probably raise my prices a little bit. And you would. You would raise your prices up until the point where you were no longer overwhelmed. An example of this that I experienced is there's my favorite noodle and soup restaurant where I went to college. I loved their food, but I rarely ate it because they were so popular that they only were open a couple of days a week. They would close for weekends, they would close for holidays, they would open late and close early because demand was so high that they could do whatever they wanted and still make a reasonable profit. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. If they started to have issues, if they started to have not make enough money, not have enough customers, maybe then they'd start opening up on the weekends when things were busier, but they didn't need to. And so that's what we're talking about. When the market is in equilibrium, there's no incentive to change behavior because raising prices or lowering prices is going to lead to an excess either in supply or demand and mean that things could be better off. It's only when we're in equilibrium that we're the best off we could possibly be. Okay? So far, so good. And it's easy to find equilibrium. It's going to be where demand and supply intersect. It's going to be the price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Okay? And you can see that in this example here. They do the same thing with the example of the gallons of gasoline, right? At lower prices below equilibrium, consumers demand more and suppliers supply less. So you have a shortage. At prices above equilibrium, firms are willing and able to supply more, but consumers don't want to pay that price. And so they reduce their demand and you have an excess supply or a surplus. Only at the equilibrium price is quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied, and that's where no one has an incentive to change their behavior. No one's going to move. Everyone's the best off they can be. So far, so good? Okay, cool. So we're going to, now that we hopefully understand this, we're going to mess it up. We're going to add a new level of complexity by talking about what happens when things change. To do this, we need to understand this Latin phrase, ceteris paribus. And this is just Latin for other things being equal. It's the idea in economics that we're only going to change one thing at a time. So we're going to look at the market for supply and demand and then change one thing and see what happens to the equilibrium. Even when we change more than one thing, we're going to do it step by step. And that's not because that's the way it is in the real world, but it's because that's how our analysis works. And that's how we can make sense of things, by tracking the step-by-step progress. Because we aren't looking at actual real-world activity here, we're modeling it. So it's going to be a little bit simplified, but that's going to allow us to get the good insight for what the model is trying to tell us. Okay? So ceteris paribus just means all else held equal or all else held constant, And so that's what we're going to assume in pretty much every economic model, especially in this chapter. Okay? So we'll start with a clean slate demand curve. And so remember, a demand curve shows us how much consumers are willing and able to buy at any given price. So we're going to see that we've got some demand curve in quantity, and price space, and it's going to be downward sloping. And what we can do here is we can do sort of just look at these sort of intuitive demand curves where we don't need to know every exact price and quantity. We can just sort of think about it in general terms. There's some given price I'm going to call P1, and there's some given quantity I'm going to call Q1. So at a given price, or I guess the book starts with 0, so let's start with 0. P0 and Q0. Sorry about that. So at P0, at a price of P0, consumers demand Q0 of whatever good we're talking about. So what happens when something changes? If price changes, we just move along that demand curve. So if price goes up to, say, P1, we're just going to say, oh, well, quantity demanded will go down to Q1, right? Oops. There we go. That would be a change in quantity demanded. But what happens if something else changes that's not price or quantity? If something else that's not price or quantity changes, then we need to do something else. So there are other determinants of demand that we're going to call non-price determinants. These are things that determine how much of a good we demand that aren't price. So one non-price determinant of demand is income. Generally, if your income goes up, what are you going to do? Think about it in terms of just arrows. Are you going to buy more of something or less of something? This could be gallons of gas. This could be your favorite lunch. This could be housing or cell phones or video games or haircuts or anything. So if income goes up, the price didn't change, but you're going to tend to buy more of whatever it is. Maybe a little more, maybe a lot more. Maybe you buy a lot more soda because you really like soda. Maybe you buy a little bit more electricity because you decide you can leave the lights on at night. Something like that. But what happens is we end up getting a new quantity at that same price, right? We had Q1 or Q0 at P0. Now we have Q1 at P0. So what we need to do is draw a new demand curve. So let's say there's a period of economic growth. Everything's going great. We're all making money. Wages go up. That's going to shift the demand curve out to the right and increase the quantity demanded at every price, right? Let's say there's another price up here, P4. Before the quantity was here, now the quantity is here. Do you see that? So that's why it's called a shift in demand, because we're changing quantity demanded at every single price. And any non-price determinant is going to do this. So there are lots, it turns out, of non-price determinants of demand. We have income as one, but it can be other things too. And what we're going to see is that this increased demand means that at every given price, the quantity demanded is higher. So we have a new higher demand curve. We can do the same thing the other direction. If instead of incomes going up, let's say we have a recession or there's a lot of layoffs or something like that, and we see incomes go down. If income goes down, what's going to happen to your demand for things? It's going to go down too, right? If income goes down, we're going to expect to see demand shift in, right? You're going to buy a little bit less of everything. You're going to put off vacation. You're going to decide that your laptop can make it another couple of months or another year. And that's what we're going to tend to see. So demand is going to shift one way or the other depending on whether income goes up or down. And so that's a non-price determinant of demand. It's going to change quantity demanded at every price, meaning it's going to shift the whole demand curve. And I do like to say shift out to the right or shift left and in, because up and down gets confusing when we put supply and demand together, and I'll show you when we get closer to that point. Okay? So what other factors can shift the demand curve? Well, we have income, we have tastes and preferences, so things like if something becomes popular, I used to talk about fidget spinners, but those are sort of old school now, so I think about those poppets. They're very cool for now, but they're going to be really lame in about one more year. And so as things become cool and then become less cool, we're going to see the demand curve shift out and then shift back in. You can also think about things like if a new study comes out. I just saw an article that said, oh, aspartame causes cancer. That's the fake sugar in diet sodas. What's that going to do? It's going to affect demand, right? It's going to decrease demand at every quantity. So those kinds of things will affect tastes and preferences. Changes in the composition of the population. So one example of this that I thought was interesting, and you can think about this in the real world. So we have an aging population in the US and in a lot of the more developed world, especially in Europe. And so as we have fewer and fewer children, we see changes in the demand for goods and services. We see less and less demand for stuff for children. We see more demand for resources for pets, right? More and more people are having pets, delaying having children. That's going to change the demand curves in those various markets. We can also see changes in the price of a substitute or a complement. So we have population composition. A substitute or a complement is a good whose price affects the other good. So substitutes are pretty easy usually because we engage with substitutes all the time. So think about, actually this just happened. I was at the store buying school supplies, buying pens, and I was trying to decide between the Crayola brand crayons for my son, and I was going to go buy them because they were a good price. And then I looked right next to it was a generic brand for half the price. Now, even though the Crayola brand crayons are cheaper than they used to be, they're still more expensive relative to the generic brand. So it's not that I'm not going to buy the Crayolas because the price is too high. It's that relative to the substitute, they're too expensive. Does that make sense? So when there are goods that you consider pretty good substitutes and one gets cheaper, you're going to buy less of the relatively more expensive thing. So think about it if, I like to think about the example of going to a cafeteria or a food court and you think you know what you want to eat for lunch and then you compare the prices. If you're like me, a lot of times you'll let price be the decider and you'll choose the less expensive good. So if I'm trying to decide between tacos and pizza, and the pizza's more expensive, I'm going to demand more tacos. So it's not that the price of tacos changed, the price of pizza went up, but I'm going to demand more tacos as a result. Another example could be the market for electric cars. We saw a huge increase in consumption of electric cars in the last couple of years. Lots of reasons why, but a big reason is rising gas prices. As gas gets more expensive, it makes driving a conventional car more expensive. And so we see, in response to that more expensive cost of driving a gas car, an increase in the demand for EVs and other alternative fuel vehicles. So that's price of a substitute. Price of a complement is a little bit trickier, but it's things that you buy together. So if you think that the perfect breakfast in the morning is a cup of coffee and a donut, and you spend $5 every morning on your coffee and a donut, and then you go to the store, you go to your favorite coffee shop, and the price of donuts has gone up from $1 to $2. That's going to affect your choice about buying that breakfast. It's not that the price of coffee went up, but because the price of the thing you buy with coffee got more expensive, you're going to tend to demand less coffee because of that price of the donut. Another example is if you buy, well, I keep doing breakfast foods, bagel and cream cheese. The price of cream cheese goes up, you buy fewer bagels. There's a silly example that a lot of economists like to use of left shoes and right shoes. Like you could buy them individually, and if a left shoe gets more expensive, you buy fewer shoes overall. That's a little silly. But if cell phones get more expensive, a complement to cell phones are cell phone cases. So if you keep your same cell phone for another year, that is going to reduce your demand of cell phone cases at every price. Okay? So those are going to be considered the price of related goods. Complements and substitutes, and they're going to go different directions. Price of a substitute goes up, demand goes up. Price of a complement goes up, demand goes down. Because if the complement gets more expensive, the experience of buying both things together is more expensive. If the substitute gets more expensive, the original good is relatively less expensive. And then the last thing is changes about expectations of the future. We can think about the car example, right? Do we expect gas prices to go back down? We do not. They've been going up for as long as gas has been around. So yeah, it might go down 20 cents here, 30 cents there, but I don't think we're ever going to see the good old days a million years ago when I was a kid where 20 bucks bought you a tank of gas and lunch. That's never going to happen. And so that's going to change demand for conventional cars and electric cars, that expectation of the future. We see that a lot in the housing market. People expect housing to get more expensive. And so that increases demand in the present because they're worried about having to pay more in the future. So expectations will also always play a role in demand in different ways. And so remember, all of these things are these non-price determinants. They're factors that affect demand, but they're going to change demand at every price, change quantity demanded at every price, shift the demand curve, which is different from price changing, which would be movement along the demand curve. Okay? So far, so good? So here you can see things that will shift the demand curve out to the right are going to be increases in popularity, population that likes the good increases. I think a fun way to look at this one is if you look at different ethnic foods being, I know that's a problematic term, but look at the types of foods sold in different grocery stores. You can see that there's going to be more of different types of food available depending on the market you're in. So when I lived in a predominantly Asian market, they would have kimchi at Costco. There's not kimchi at my Costco now because the population likely to buy kimchi is less in my market. Income is going to have a huge effect. If income goes up, we're going to see demand shift out. Price of a substitute goes up, demand shifts out. Price of a complement goes down. If the price of cream cheese goes down, I'm going to buy more bagels. And then future expectations that might encourage buying. If I think I'm going to get a raise in the future, I think the economy is going to be good. That'll increase demand for everything. Factors that are going to decrease demand, it's going to be the opposite. Decreased popularity, population that buys a good decreases, income goes down, price of a substitute goes down, price of a complement goes up, or there's some kind of future expectations that would discourage me from buying things. If I think we're going to have a nuclear war tomorrow, I'm probably not going to buy a new car. I'm going to wait it out. That's my silly example. So those are our non-price determinants that can affect demand. And already we've talked about some of this, but we want to talk about these different types of goods. We talked a little bit about a substitute. A substitute is just something that we can use in place of another thing, a good or service that we can use in place of another good or service. So a really great way to think about substitutes is sort of name brand and generic brand. But you could think about the difference between jeans and sweatpants, right? They're substitutes. And substitutes can be strong substitutes or weak substitutes. So if I'm trying to decide between buying a marker, I might think that a U brand marker is a good substitute for an Expo marker, or I might think that because this is such a small size, it's not a very close substitute. So it works in a pinch, but I'd be willing to pay a little more. So there are strengths and weaknesses of substitutes and complements. Complements are just goods and services that are used together to complement each other, to enhance the usage or the consumption of each other. Excuse me. The other two terms on here, normal good and inferior good, we haven't talked about yet. But this gets back to this first non-price determinant, because I said generally when income goes up, we're going to see demand increase, and when income goes down, we're going to see demand decrease. And that's true for what we consider normal goods. Normal goods are goods that you buy more of when your income goes up. But we don't buy more of everything when our income goes up. There are some things that we buy less of. If your income goes up and you stop buying a thing or buy less of it, then it's probably an inferior good. And so you could say, oh, well, maybe inferior goods are store brands instead of name brands. So I used to use, Great Harvest or Open Market or whatever the store brand is, and now I buy Kellogg's or whatever. So that would make the store brand an inferior good. I also like to, this is a really fun thing to talk about in a classroom, because we can talk about what we consider inferior goods in our lives. Everybody has some differences. You can think public transportation might be an inferior good. You'd rather take your own vehicle, but when your budget is tight, or if you don't have a lot of money, you take the bus. It could be things like ramen noodles, not good ramen from the shop, but those little packs of 99-cent or 35-cent ramen noodles could be considered an inferior good. As you get more money, you buy better quality noodles, you buy better quality food, that kind of thing. So an inferior good is just something that you consume more of when your income is low, but as you get wealthier, you can afford to not buy it anymore. Okay? Makes sense? Think about it in your own life. If you've ever had a really tight budget and there was something that you bought and you said, wow, I'd never want to buy this again, but I will if I have to. That's what we're talking about. Okay? Now we want to do the same thing we did before. We want to look at the supply side. The supply curve shows us the relationship between quantity supplied and price, right? At every given price, there is a set quantity supplied, and we're going to tend to see our supply curves be upward sloping. So we can do the same thing we did with demand and look at not just what would cause movement along the supply curve, but what would cause a shift in the supply curve. So we start out with our supply curve where we have a given price, P0, and a given quantity. And if the price went up, we would see quantity supplied go up, and that would be movement along the supply curve, right? But we can also see the supply curve shift in the same way we saw with the demand curve when there's a change in a non-price determinant of supply. And so that's going to be a situation where something else affects the cost associated with producing a good. And the way we can think about this is say, okay, well, the price that a firm costs is going to be in part the cost of production and in part their desired profit. And so what we're going to say is, if we see something happen that increases the cost of production, that's not going to move us along the supply curve. It's going to make it more expensive to supply goods at every price. And that would be a shift in the supply curve. So let's talk about some examples and see if we can get some intuition for this. So let me get us back to where we started. And when we see anything happen that's going to increase the cost of production, we're going to see a new higher cost shift the supply curve in to the right. And so if we say, my favorite example of this is if we have an increase in worker wages, because that raises the cost of everything, right? An increase in worker wages is going to make it more expensive to supply the same quantity of goods. But that's going to be true for every quantity, right? All along the supply curve. And so what that's going to mean is we're going to see a new higher supply curve representing those higher costs. So when the cost of production increases for any reason, it could be a change in technology, it could be a change in input costs, we're going to see the supply curve shift in to the left. And you can see how up is kind of weird here. On the other hand, if we see the cost of production go down, let's say there's new technology that makes it cheaper to produce your good or service. You could think about if this is an increase in worker wages, we could have the other one be new technology, new machinery that makes it cheaper to produce. If that lowers the cost of production, that's going to shift the supply curve out, lowering the cost at every price, or lowering the cost at every quantity supplied. And so it's the same thing. It's not the price of the good we're supplying changing, it's the cost, the underlying costs. We can also see expectations play a role, any non-price determinant of supply. And so we'll see decreased supply mean that at every price quantity supplied is lower, increased supply mean that the supply curve shifts and at every price the quantity supplied is higher. So it's going to be different things like input prices, technology, government policies, imposing or removing taxes or restrictions and regulations. One thing we see in the housing market is an increase in permit requirements for building has raised the cost of producing houses and reduced our housing supply, shifting the supply curve. And so one of the things we want to keep track of here is inputs or other factors of production. Anything that's used to produce the good we're talking about can be considered an input. Labor, materials, land, those are all factors of production that we combine to produce goods and services. Okay, so natural conditions, input prices, technology, and government policies can affect supply. And if you're unsure about natural conditions, we'll do an example in just a minute with salmon, but think about if you are a farmer, if you're working in agriculture. Good weather or bad weather is going to raise or lower the cost of producing your output. And so natural weather conditions can have an effect on the cost of production at every level. So here again, you have that nice little summary where it says, okay, if we have better conditions, lower prices, better technology, or fewer regulations and lower taxes, we're going to see supply shift out to the right, increasing the quantity supplied at every price. If we have bad conditions, higher input prices, worse technology. The example I always do is if there's a natural crisis. So think about when there's a hurricane or an earthquake, if the electricity grid goes down, that's going to raise the cost of production. Also, costly regulations or higher taxes. Those are going to shift supply in, raising the cost of production for every quantity supplied or reducing the quantity supplied at every price. So now we have the tools to find equilibrium given some problem with the market. It's an easy step-by-step process. We draw the supply and demand model. We impose a change in the economy. We determine whether it affects supply or demand. We determine whether the curve shifts out to the right or in to the left, and then we identify the new equilibrium and say, did price go up or go down? Did quantity go up or go down? So let's do an example together. So let's do this here. You've got the answer on the slides, but I'm going to do it with you step by step. So we're going to start with the market for salmon. And so we have, and I'm going to do what I call a qualitative model. There are real values on the graph and in the textbook, but we're going to go ahead and keep it simple and qualitative, which means I just want to know generally the direction that the curves move and the general direction of the equilibrium change. Okay, so I've got supply and demand, and most importantly, I have my initial equilibrium. That's my equilibrium price, oops, and that's my equilibrium quantity. Okay, now what happens? Excellent weather conditions during the summer mean that there are more salmon spawning, more salmon in the rivers, and so the quantity of salmon available to be fished increases. There's more fish in the sea. How easy is it? Does it get easier or harder to catch them? Easier. So these favorable conditions are going to have an effect on this market. Are they going to affect supply or demand? Well, there's more salmon. That doesn't say anything about consumer preferences. That is talking about where we get the salmon from. So that's a supply side issue. So those good weather conditions, right? Favorable conditions are gonna tend to affect supply. Now, are they going to increase supply or decrease supply? Well, it's good news, right? Better conditions, more fish, easier to catch them. We're going to expect supply to increase. That means it's going to shift out so that we can supply more at every given price. So now we need to find the new equilibrium. And this kind of trips people up sometimes. That's why I like to do different colors. That's why I like to label things, 0, 1, 2. So I want to use my initial demand curve because demand has not changed. What has changed is supply. Supply has increased. So this is my new equilibrium, and I'm going to label it Q1, P1. So what's happened to the equilibrium? We've seen an increase in the equilibrium quantity and a decrease in the price. So good conditions mean it's easier and more affordable to produce salmon, which means the price is going to go down and more is on the market. It's going to shift the supply curve out to the right and move us along the demand curve. Okay? So far, so good? Okay. So now let's think of another example. From 2004 to 2012, the share of Americans who got their news from digital sources increased. So let's look at how this affected consumption of print news. And so I'm going to keep it really simple, but think about who you know who has ever bought or subscribed to a newspaper. So we're going to look at quantity and price of newspapers. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start out in equilibrium with some initial demand curve and some initial supply curve. And I don't need to be precise here. I just need to kind of have a sense for these things. I've got my initial equilibrium, Q0, and my initial equilibrium price, P0. And then what's going to happen? If more people are getting their news from digital sources, from their phones, from computers, and fewer people, well, yeah, is that going to affect demand or supply, first of all? Consumers. We're talking about consumers, so that's a demand side thing. It's a change in preferences, right? People are preferring digital media to traditional paper media. So that's going to be a shift in demand. Is demand going to increase to the right or decrease to the left? It's going to decrease. As people shift more to digital media, they're going to decrease their consumption of newspapers. And then all we need to do is find the new equilibrium here. It's a lower quantity of newspapers, and so they're going to have to lower prices. So far, so good? Super straightforward, right? You guys got it. Okay, cool. What happens if we do two things? This is the combo. I don't love this example, but it's a pretty good example. I'll give you guys another example. I'm going to try and record another video that gives you another example to take a look at. But in this example, we can use the four-step approach to look at increases in wages or labor compensation and an increase in digital communication. And so what we're looking at here is the market for the post office. And that's one of the things that I think is important to remember to do when you do this is what market are we looking at? So we're looking at the market for the U.S. Postal Service, and we're going to start out in an initial equilibrium, and then we want to figure out which two things are happening. So I told you we'd only do one thing at a time, and I lied, because sometimes we want to do both. And so let me mock this up really quickly. So we're going to see, this is the quantity and price for the U.S. Postal Service, and we're going to start out with our initial demand curve and our initial supply curve and our initial equilibrium. And then we're going to do two things. First, we're going to increase worker compensation. We're going to increase wages. Is that going to affect supply or demand? Wages are a cost of production, a cost of a factor of production. Labor is an input to everything, and sorting mail and delivering it is pretty labor intensive. So that's going to affect the supply curve. Is it going to shift it out, producing more, or shift it in, making production more expensive? It's going to shift supply in, so that will make it more expensive to produce mail service at every price. Then something else happened, right? We also have the increase in emails and other digital communication, which leads to a decrease in what we'll call traditional mail, snail mail, right? When was the last time you wrote a letter and bought a stamp? Is that going to be a supply side or a demand side change? It's consumers, right? It's how our behavior is. It's not the supply anymore. Now this is the demand side. Consumers are going to use more email, do less traditional mail. So what's that going to do to the demand for USPS services? Increase or decrease? It's going to decrease demand, shifting the demand curve in to the left. So here's what we know. We know that the quantity is going to go down. If you were following along and did this with me, you might have a different outcome. Because depending on how far you shift those curves, you could end up with a higher price, a lower price. It could go either way. When you shift more than one thing, you can get an ambiguous outcome. But what we know for sure is there's going to be less production of U.S. Postal Service. It's going to make it harder for the U.S. Postal Service to stay in business. We know for sure the quantity is going down. The price might go up. It could go down. It probably will. Cool? So if we put these two diagrams together, they have kind of the same outcome as me. Here's the initial condition. Here's with the decrease or supply, the shift in supply from increased wage compensation. And then we get a new equilibrium when we reduce demand. And so the third equilibrium here shows the combination of both effects. Like I said, if you drew it slightly differently, you could very much get a lower price instead of a higher price, but this is what we tend to see. So basically bad news for the U.S. Postal Service. So this is a really important difference. And I told you at the beginning, it's going to be important to differentiate between demand and quantity demanded and supply and quantity supplied. The same thing is happening here. We need to differentiate between movement along the curve and shifts in the curve. So a movement along the curve is going from here to here. The shift is going from here to here. Moving along the demand curve, shifting the supply curve. And then over here, moving from this point to this point is a movement along the supply curve, but this is a shift in the demand curve. So shifting curves, demand or supply, happens. Movement along the curve is a change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied. Okay? Cool. The next thing we want to talk about is price controls. Price controls are just laws that regulate price. A price ceiling is a limit on how high the price can go. You can't go above that price limit. A price floor is a limit on how low the price can go. You can't go below that lower limit. And like I said, we do see examples of price ceilings and price floors in daily life. The price ceiling, common example, tends to be rent control. The price floor tends to be wages, minimum wage laws. But we're going to do an example that's more based on trade. So first we have the example of rent control. And there's a weird, kind of counterintuitive part to this, which is whether a price control is binding or not depends on whether it's too high or too low. A binding price ceiling is going to be a really low ceiling. So let's say we're here in this market that they've got posted up here. I'm going to do my quantity and my price. And then I've got supply and demand. And so there's demand and supply. And at equilibrium, the rent is $500. So this is from 100 million years ago. And the equilibrium quantity is, let's say, 15,000 rental units, right? That's our equilibrium. So let's say that the government says, hey, we like that. We're not going to let prices get any higher than that. So we're going to put in a price ceiling right here. It's a limit on how high rents can go, right? Now, what happens if we're in Sacramento and more people are moving to Sacramento from Bay Area? What's that going to do to the market for housing? Is it going to affect demand or supply? More people moving here, an increase in population is going to tend to shift that demand for housing out. So now we're going to have higher demand. Normally, that would result in this new higher equilibrium. But there's this law that says, no, you can't raise prices. Rents have to stay right here. So the quantity demanded at this rate, at this level, is 19,000 units. But what's the supply? The supply is going to stay stuck here at 15 because firms would actually charge a lot more money to supply those 19,000 units. They would charge $700, right? If you look at the point right here on the slides from 19 up to supply, there's this dot here that goes over to about 700. So what we're going to see is the rent control rule does keep rents at $500, but that means price can't respond to demand. And so what we're going to have is a shortage. We're going to have a shortage of 4,000 apartments because of that rent control. So rent control is an example of a price ceiling, which is a price control. And price controls tend to keep us away from equilibrium where we could have been, and we might have been a little better off, right? People would have paid more rent, but there would have been more units available on the market. Same thing with a price floor. A price floor is a limit on how low the price can go. We see this, like I said, with minimum wage. We can also see it with trade laws. So the US produces a lot of grain, but Europe can also produce grains. And if we don't like the price they're selling it for, we can say, hey, you are not allowed to import grain below a certain price. So let's say the equilibrium would be right here, and the equilibrium price is right here. If we're worried about the import of European wheat, we can put in a price floor and we can say, hey, listen, maybe this is $1 per ton of wheat. And we say, no, you need to at least charge $2 per ton of wheat. That's going to be the price ceiling. Now what happens is we have an excess supply. At this high price, people don't want to buy that European wheat, so the quantity demanded is low, but the quantity supplied is very high. We see the same thing with wages. If we raise the minimum wage, more people want to work, fewer people get hired, we have excess labor or unemployment. So the big idea here is these price controls are usually designed to fix a problem, but what they really tend to do is generate more economic problems by either creating a surplus or a shortage and keeping us away from equilibrium where the market works the way it's supposed to. The last thing we want to talk about is demand, supply, and efficiency. And the big idea here is that markets tend to make everyone better off. And this comes from this idea of welfare economics and consumer surplus and producer surplus. So when the market works the way it's supposed to, we have our demand curve and our supply curve. And the demand curve represents the consumer's willingness to pay. And if you think about it, this makes sense. Think about all the people you know in your life. Some people are kind of free with their money and spend it easily. Some people are not. I identify as a cheapo. I do not like to pay a lot of money. I like to pay very little money. So the demand curve says, yeah, some people would pay a lot, some people would pay a little. But when we go to the store, do we all pay different prices? No, that's the great thing about a market. We all pay the same price. If you have a higher willingness to pay for a sandwich than I do, when we go to the sandwich shop, we're all going to pay $10 for that sandwich. And so the equilibrium price is the same for everybody, regardless of what we buy. That means that there's this area below the demand curve and above the price line that is the difference between what every single person here would have paid for that sandwich and the price they actually paid. We call that consumer surplus. And it's great. It means that we pay the price that is based on this demand and supply equilibrium, and it's going to tend to be lower than our willingness is to pay. What about the poor producers? Do they lose out on this? Heck no, they have their own surplus. That's because different producers have different costs of production. Think about Starbucks versus your local coffee shop versus Dutch Bros versus other coffee shops. They all have different prices, right? Starbucks, some of them have those really, really big places where there's lots of space to sit. That's going to cost them a lot more in terms of rent fees than being Dutch Bros and just being a little hut. And so they're going to have different costs, but they're going to tend to charge pretty similar prices. The market says there's going to be an equilibrium price for a cup of coffee. Starbucks can't charge $10 for a cup of coffee. Dutch Bros can't either. So they're all going to tend to accept, within a margin, accept that same market price. And so the really efficient firms get a really nice surplus, and the less efficient firms get a less surplus. This space above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price, that's producer surplus. And that's the benefit firms get from engaging in the economy. Consumer surplus is the benefit to consumers for being in the economy, in a market economy. Producer surplus is the benefit producers get for being in a market economy. When we add them together, we get social surplus or economic surplus or total surplus. It's the total welfare associated with the economy, and it's the biggest it can be in equilibrium. That's total surplus. What happens if it goes wrong? Well, if we have a price control, like let's say we have a binding price floor, then we're going to have an inefficiency, right? We're going to see the quantity demanded be much lower than the quantity supplied, which means we're going to have the market, sorry, I know this just got really messy, but what this is going to mean then is that only this quantity gets produced and consumed. And so we miss out on all this area of economic activity. The difference between quantity demanded and Q0 is right here. This red triangle of death, of doom, where it's economic activity that doesn't happen, that's called deadweight loss. That's the loss in total surplus that occurs when there's an inefficient quantity, either because of a rule or a regulation or because something's wrong with the market. And we tend to see it when there's an intervention in the market, but economists hate this, and that's why we call it deadweight loss, because that's the worst thing we could think of. So that's the sort of welfare economics. That's the argument that markets organize economic activity the best because we don't see this deadweight loss. We only see this deadweight loss when we get in the way of the market. Okay? So here you can see the very, very attractive example from the textbook where you can see consumer surplus below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. Producer surplus is above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price. Total welfare is that total triangle between demand and supply, all the way up to equilibrium quantity. And then a price floor or a price ceiling is going to tend to reduce economic activity. Here, the price ceiling takes total surplus from area TUVWX to just TVX, right? Same thing over here with the price floor. We see a decrease in economic activity. We see deadweight loss of JK. Less economic activity is being engaged in. There's units not being bought and sold, and that harms the economy. It harms producers and it harms consumers. That's it. Okay, that's it. I know that was kind of a long chapter, a lot of new terms, a lot of big ideas. Like I said, I'll try to get an example put up for you, so take a look at that. And really, I do think it helps to go through the numerical examples in these cases to really get a sense of what we're talking about. Again, these are mostly micro concepts, but we're going to use these ideas over and over again as we start to talk about the macro economy. So let me know what you think. Make sure to go through and look at all your Canvas assignments, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.